Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Until we begin, if you could put your name and organization into the chat. There's going to be about 60 of us attending this morning. Thank you. Good morning. For those of you that are just jumping on, there's going to be about 60 of us attending this morning. So if you could in the chat, please enter your name and organization. That's how I'm going to be able to track attendance. And we'll be getting started directly at 10. Thank you. Good morning, Jeffrey.
Good morning, Avery. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I've got you as a co-host, and we're going to wait until right at 10 o'clock to get started. We should have about 60 on the line this morning.
No problem. Um, just let me know.
I will.
Are you gonna provide just a brief introduction or what?
Of course I am.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to know.
I
Sometimes they
got
just
you.
sometimes they
I
just
got
turn
you.
it on and say go.
No, I got your bio right here, sir.
No problem. No, yeah, I didn't. I'm not asking for an official address.
I'm
All
going to
right,
give them a little bit of intro. They're going to
no
get a
problem.
bit of an intro here.
No problem.
For those of you that are just jumping on, if you could, please put your name and organization into the chat. We're expecting quite a large group this morning, so we won't be doing introductions. And this way, this will give me a record of who's attended. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We've got about one more minute till we begin. As you're coming into the room, if you could please put your name into the chat along with your organization. We're going to have a big group with us this morning, so we won't be doing introductions. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It is 10 o'clock. I see we've got about 44 individuals on the line now, 45. We're looking at about 60 people. I hope that's how many registered to come on this morning. So as you do come in the room, please enter your name and organization into the chat. The group this large, we're not going to be able to do personal introductions. And with that, I want to introduce you to our speaker this morning. We have with us Jeffrey Lorick. Jeffrey is currently the director of the Pinellas County Office of Human Rights, where he has been so since 2016. Jeffrey is a dedicated civil rights leader. He has been a keynote speaker for national and international civil rights.
Avery, if I can interrupt you, your audio is really bad.
Speaking on topics such as fair housing and cultural diversity. He currently provides a safeguard for the civil violation as well as the social and economic liberties of the
Hey, Avery.
Pinellas County and surrounding communities. And we are all extremely fortunate to have Jeffrey as a active member of your Continuum of Care's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Mr. Jeffrey Lorick.
Hi,
Take it
Avery.
away, Jeffrey.
Hi, Avery. Your audio was really, really bad.
Yes.
But it's okay because they didn't need to hear that long bio.
I am so sorry, everybody. I'm having a lot of technical problems this morning.
Yeah.
So I will turn it right over to you, Jeffrey, to take over.
I got it. Thank you so much. Let me see if I can share my screen with everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is always.
Jeffrey, could you go ahead and start?
Did anybody hear that? I sure didn't. Hold on. Do you guys see my PowerPoint? Huh?
No, we
we
can't.
cannot.
No,
Next, no, maybe. Okay. Hold on. What about now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I say it's loading.
Great. Thank you. Go to slideshow. Good morning, everyone. So glad to have you all here. I'm certainly glad to be here. You're going to have a fair housing training this morning. The focus on this particular fair housing training will focus on transitional housing, emergency shelters, domestic violence shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing. So it's specifically tailored for this, but the Fair Housing Act covers all forms of housing. But I wanted to tailor this to the community in which I was going to be addressing today. We can make it interactive if you like. If you have a question about a slide that comes up, you can certainly unmute yourself and ask for clarification. We only have about an hour here. I'm not a presenter who looks at the chat. So if you put a question in the chat, I probably won't get to it till the end unless Avery, with her bad audio, alerts me that there's a question in the chat. So with that, I'm going to keep it moving. So Fair Housing Act. There we go. There we go. The Fair Housing Act protects the rights of all people from discrimination in housing. The Fair Housing Act covers most housing, rental properties, including nonprofit housing, shelters, transitional housing, and programs. The Fair Housing Act applies to other entities who could make housing available. And you can see there that there are clean and sober housing facilities, temporary or long-term shelters, and transitional houses and motels are covered under the Fair Housing Act. But it covers anyone who makes housing, that could make housing unavailable. The Fair Housing Act has a definition for dwelling. It is broad. It is defined as any building or structure or portion therefore in which occupancy, which is occupied as or designed intended for occupancy as a resident. They also include the length of stay, the intention and right to return each night to a particular area of building, the amenities, bathrooms, bedrooms, kitchen facilities, how is the property marked or marketed, written terms for occupancy. They could be rental agreements. They could be an application to stay at a homeless shelter or transitional shelter. Domestic violence are not likely, victims of domestic violence are not necessarily designated to return to a domestic violence shelter the very next day, but they could. And so it could also be considered as a dwelling. We're going to talk about what makes your agencies fit under the Fair Housing Law. And it is that any agency who receives any monies from the federal government, 1 red cent from the federal government, you are covered by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. You are covered under the American Disabilities Act of 1990, and you're covered under the Fair Housing Law. So any organization receiving federal funding or that some sort of federal funding is being applied to what you do, you are covered under Fair Housing Law, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and also Title II, which we're going to get into. Title II is the American Disabilities Act, which means you cannot discriminate against individuals with disabilities in programs, services, and activities provided or made available for public entities. persons with disability have as much right to access a facility as anybody else. Anywhere the public goes, a person with a disability should have access. It applies again, we're talking about the transitional housing, emergency shelters that operate by receiving federal or state local funds. These are the protected categories that are covered under fair housing law. It's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. Those are the groups that are covered under the American Disabilities Act, under Title VII, under Title II. All of these individuals are protected classes, is what we call in our business. Families with children under the age of, say, 18, it could be one person with a child under 18, that's called familial status. They cannot be discriminated against or otherwise denied housing because they are a parent. There are some limited situations where they may be omitted. Just if there's a single room or cot or dorm kind of shelter, there might be some exemptions there. Familiar status. Avoid rules that say adults must be supervised. Adults must supervise children at all times. It's not appropriate to require supervision of older teenagers. Teenagers can be used as babysitters. That's not unusual. So if you have a rule, somebody's in your shelter or facility and they have a teenage child and they're in a part of the building playing around, and then you go to the parents and say, we have a rule that children must be supervised, that might be looked at as discrimination under familial status. So just be mindful that it could apply to that small, but might seem to be insignificant form of discrimination.
Can I ask a question about that?
Absolutely.
So, and I mean, I feel like I know the answer because I used to work for APD, but are there exceptions to those clients with like disabilities? So if they have a lower IQ or have another type of disability and a shelter requires them to have, I guess, eyes on them at all times? Or is it just
we're going to cover disability a whole lot during this training.
Okay, and that's fine.
No.
The answer because I used to work.
It's a great question. Again, a person with a disability, like anybody else inside of the facilities, has the ability to go anywhere else in the building that the public goes. There could be some exceptions only if the child might put themselves in harm. Then there are some different things that might kick in.
And that's what I thought the exception was, right?
But they must be reasonable. That's the point. They must be reasonable. And so these are some of the places most commonly where discrimination shows up. It's during the application process. Sometimes there's steering that goes on. You might be better served at the shelter down the street than here. Segregating populations once they enter this shelter, and then expressing or publicizing preferences that we're family, and it could be as simply as we're family.
Your
friends.
keys in my room on the dresser.
Make sure you mute yourself.
Your keys in my room on the dresser.
If you are on this platform,
you pay that ticket.
You want to mute your mic.
Because your license is gonna get suspended if you don't pay it before the 27th, baby. All right.
Hey, Alberta. Alberta.
Yes.
You're not on mute, hon.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I wish I could help you find your keys, Alberta. However, so we most often see it show up in the application process. And so I was talking about publishing preferences. Say you can simply be advertising that we're a family-friendly shelter. Guess what that's doing? That's expressing preferences. So you must be careful about what you publish and put out there. giving different terms and condition and treatment based on those protected categories that we talked about. And that's in procedures, rules, rent criteria, fees, charges, and etc. They must be the same across the board for everybody. If not, then you could potentially find yourself in a fair housing complaint of discrimination. If you have any established rules or policies that seem to target specific protected classes, could be form of discrimination, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. You always have to be aware that people don't feel harassed or threatened or cursed or because of some minor incidents have their privileges revoked or somebody does something and then get retaliated against. Those are a lot of areas where we see discrimination show up. Prioritizing applications. In most general screening selection, a lot of times they have chronological order, first come, first serve. And again, whatever those rules are, they must be applied consistently. You can't have one person come in and say, listen, we have a list, so you'll just have to wait till your term come up and then somebody else comes in and miraculously there is no list or they get moved ahead. Just make sure it's consistent. And it's okay in certain situations to give priority to clients, basically for specialized services, for alcohol treatment, drug treatment kind of facilities. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Shelter Care Plus is, this is exactly what I was talking about. Shelter Care Plus recipients may establish preferences as a part of their administrative processes for one or more of these statutory target populations.
Sonia. Text Sonia.
Please mute yourself if you're on this training for target populations for serious mental illness, alcohol, substance abuse, or if you're treating persons with AIDS or related AIDS issues. Other eligible disabled homeless people, say you're running a treatment center for the mental health issues or alcoholism, and that facility might have 20 or 30 beds in it, and you're only using 5 or 6. You could adjust your policies to accept other persons from the homeless community to use those spare rooms, if you will, even though it's designed for a specific population. But it is really based on the demand of the particular facility for its target populations. HMIS, I know it's a big reporting system in your community. Questions about a person's disabilities or questions that might reveal the presence of a disability are prohibited. And that's specifically designed for a person with disabilities. So in other words, asking the person if they have a disability could be a violation of discrimination laws. Even in EOC, they have the fact that, we're in this pandemic situation going on, COVID-19, and everybody's concerned about vaccination. In EEOC law, they said if you even ask a person if they're vaccinated, you're really asking them a medical question. So you want to be very careful that you don't ask any disability-related questions in the intake process. After the intake process is completed and the application, the date and they have been admitted into a shelter, then the staff may explain the purpose of the HMIS system. Because some people will be hesitant to maybe answer questions if they think they answer wrong and it's going to keep them out of the shelter. So you want to make sure that they get past that process and don't feel like there's a barrier there. Let me see, services. any service assessment questions in HMIS, you want to make sure that they don't target a population based on those protected categories in terms of race and color and gender and familial status. Because if you do, then again, it could likely apply to be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So and all I'm really saying is you want to examine your processes from intake all the way through the process, that there might not be an opportunity to discriminate a person based on their protected class. It is important that you train your staff, any recipients or sub-recipients, that they understand the equal access rule. Staff must be trained, or any contractors, to ensure that anyone who interacts directly with potential clients are aware of discrimination laws, but then once you become aware of it, that you address it promptly and quickly. That's one of the things that we ask. When you were made aware that a process or procedure during the intake process was perceived as discriminatory, what did you do as an agency to quickly correct the problem or address it? And if that piece is missing, it can be problematic in a fair housing claim. Moreover, they should provide training to the staff on completing the intake, and consistent with this guidance, if HUD finds a subrecipient has failed to meet these program requirements, HUD will take action. And the action could be losing your funding. That's how important and serious these issues are. The equal access rule is this: eliminating eligibility criteria that tends to screen people out with disabilities, unless necessary to the provision of service, to ensure the program are physically accessible. A lot of folks don't know this. When you're dealing with the deaf and the hard of hearing community, you must provide auxiliary aid to assist them in hearing, to ensure effective communication. That is the term that we use a lot when we're investigating fair housing cases when it comes to the deaf and hard of hearing community. What did you do to try to effectively communicate with the person? In some cases, it could be a simple note writing and exchanging of notes. It could be typing something on a tablet or a pad and then letting the individual read it. It could be having an ASL interpreter available. So whatever that is, that you have to provide that accommodation. And we'll talk about that in a little greater detail as well. Effective communications when dealing with the deaf and hard of hearing is really, really important. So how do we avoid some of these potential pitfalls of discrimination? Have clear objectives that are consistent, standardized forming and screening based on facts. If you talk about rental history or income, as long as they're consistent, observable behavior. This is another thing that's really important when it comes to the deaf and hard of hearing community. Some persons in those communities have the ability to read lips. Sometimes they will try to speak in a manner and the words are not clear and the words might be slurred, and sometimes it has been misinterpreted as that they have been under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So be sure when you're observing a behavior that you don't inappropriately apply an opinion that could be wrong. So you want to be mindful of that. Common types of discriminations that we often see in sheltered communities is a refusal and a denial for services, particularly of persons from the LGBT and the disabled community. What are ways that the discrimination may show up? It's a misrepresentation of the availability of rooms for persons of those communities. It's a failure to make a reasonable accommodation for a person with a disability. And we're going to talk a lot about reasonable accommodation and modifications as we go through this training. Any questions so far from anyone? We're going to cover a lot of information. Any questions so far? All right. Disparate impact on unintentional.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey, I have, oh, I'll put it in chat.
Well, I'm not going to monitor the chat. I don't monitor the chat when I'm training. I don't have that ability. But somebody can shout it out to me.
Okay. So how to ensure we are giving them the service they need if we are not to ask if they have a disability?
Great question. We're going to get to that even more in depth when we get to the disability piece. But you're absolutely right. You can't. There's two things that come up. In some cases, the disability isn't readily apparent, and you may have to ask. I really want to wait till I get to that section. I don't want to get ahead. Is that okay? But remind me if I don't answer that question. Okay, please do, because we deal with that. Okay, so disparate impact and unintentional consequences. Rules can seem to be non-discriminatory on their face, but have a disparate impact on other communities or protected classes. We often see this when it comes to folks who have a felony background. You may have a policy, no felons, and that policy could have an unintended impact on Brown and Black communities, because so many members of the Brown and Black community disproportionately have felonies on their records. And some felons may have happened, a person 18 years old, drinking, accidentally hurt somebody, and haven't had an incident since. So be careful, because it could have a disparate impact on those communities if you have a no felony policy. Again, you should have a felony policy, but it should be restrictive and consistent across the board. You can ask, how long has it been? Is it a violent felony? You might ask a specific question, but as long as you ask them to everybody, okay, across the board. Where we most see disparate impact, communities that are impacted by neutral policies are the transgender community. Why? Because somebody from the transgender community might show up at a women's only shelter or men's only shelter. We'll talk about that more. There can be disparate impact, disparate impact where you have a place where people take public showers to the general population, and the transgender person might be at threat or uncomfortable in the situation, or other people might be uncomfortable. Asking for a urine example in front of staff, you want to be careful not to do that. ID requirements could affect national origin, and so you want to be careful about ID requirements. You can ask for an ID, you might not ask. So some people ask for a state. The only qualifying ID is a driver's license. As long as it is a credible ID, you should be able to check, because it can affect people of national origin. All right. The American Disabilities Act of 1990, Title III, specifically speaks to the disabled community. Prohibits discrimination against a person with a disability or those affiliated with a person with a disability. Public accommodation, and you're going to hear a lot about public accommodation. Public accommodations are any places where the public can go. Hospitals, shopping centers, movie theaters, restaurants, shelters, anywhere that the public can have access to are covered under Title III when it comes to the American Disabilities Act. That includes homeless shelters and emergency shelters, private-owned entities who serve the public. If they serve the public, then the disabled community is welcome. And what happens in this case, most often what we see, there will be a public entity that has public restrooms available. A person with a disability come in a wheelchair, asked to use the public facility and they get to the restroom and find out that it's not handicap accessible. You got a problem. We get a lot of complaints like that. Anywhere, if you are open to the public can come in, they have access to your facilities. Persons with disability must have the same level of access. Also, for programs for the persons with disability, you must provide a reasonable accommodation in your policies and practice and to remove any physical barriers to the extent that is readily achievable. Rules, policies, and practices. It takes a lot of different forms when it comes to the disabled community. And we'll talk about service animals a little bit too. That if you have a no pet policy and a person who is a qualified disabled person, and we'll give you the definition in a minute, shows up with a service animal and you have a shelter that says no pets, that service animal is allowed in. Why? Because it's not a pet, it's an assistive device. So you may have to adjust your policy or practice as it relates to that. So here's the definition of the disabled. It's an individual with a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more life's activity. That individual is regarded of having such an impairment, and the individual has a record of such, that they have that impairment for a disability. If you're operating an emergency shelter, it is likely to be considered a public accommodation facility, which is covered under Title III. And this is important for the communities in which you all serve. You don't only fall under the Fair Housing Act, but you can also fall under Title III, the American Disabilities Act of 1990, and then being a place of accommodation, Title II as well. So you're thoroughly covered under all of these federal laws. If a shelter is a transient or short-term facility, a facility that maybe is just set up for a weather event or something to that effect, Title III still applies, meaning that you can't lock out people because of those protected classes. If it is a long-term shelter, it is certainly covered under the Fair Housing Act. So you can see a short-term facility will be covered under Title III. A long-term facility can be covered under the Fair Housing Law. So who are you protected against? Who could you, I'll use this word, discriminate against? Sex offenders, people who use or currently using illegal drugs, although somebody who can be a threat to the health and safety of not only themselves, but the people who are in the facilities. People who can substantially create damage to the property of other folk. This is important to understand. And again, we're going to get into reasonable accommodation and modifications in a minute. If a person, say, has an episode because they're not on their medication and they cause property damage, but their condition can be controlled with medication, and they come in and they say, listen, you banned me from the shelter, but I want to assure you that I was not on my meds at the time. I'm now under treatment that controls those kind of emotional outbursts. I'm going to ask for a reasonable accommodation to be readmitted into the facility. So you want to make sure you don't take assumptions and that they have to be based with factual evidence when you talk about excluding folks. Okay, so now we're going to talk about reasonable accommodation. An individual with a disability and ask for a reasonable accommodation or modification. The requirement does not have to be in writing, although I suggest that you put it in writing so you can have evidence in case you don't receive it. You can put it in text, you can put it in an email, you can put it in writing, but it doesn't have to be, not under law, written down. So the word accommodation and modification doesn't have to be used. It could be, I have mobility issues and I don't have the ability to navigate steps. So I'm asking for a first floor unit. What they just asked for is an accommodation. Modifications are more like ramps, adjusting light fixtures, widening doorways. Those are modifications where there's an actual change to the physical environment. An accommodation could be an exception to a policy, a rule that governs your agency. The request should be granted. If you receive federal funding, you have an obligation under law to meet those requests, if possible. We'll talk about the other two reasons why you may not. If a person meets the definition of disabled, and we talked about that earlier, that's someone who has a mental or physical limitation of one or more life's activities. When somebody makes a request for a reasonable accommodation, they must create a nexus. And please keep me tracked on time, because I got to go faster. They must have a nexus or reason why the accommodation is necessary. The reasonable accommodation provider must make a reasonable accommodation. Again, I already talked about it in the rules, policies, and services when necessary to afford a person with a disability equal access to services and the facilities. Again, removing barriers wherever they're possible so that you can integrate the ADA community just like anyone else into your facilities. There are only two reasons why under federal housing or Fair Housing Act or Title III that you don't have to make these exemptions. If it's an undue administrative or financial burden, an undue administrative or financial burden, it fundamentally alters the nature of your program. Quick example, if I can. Someone in your program develop some mobility issues. They can no longer make it to their mailbox. They make an accommodation request that could you have somebody pick up my mail for me? I have a mobility issue. We're not in the mail delivery business. We provide housing. So you don't have to provide that kind of accommodation. When somebody makes a reasonable accommodation request or a modification request, if they are not reasonable, you don't have to make that accommodation. Although you should engage in the interactive process to see how you can make that modification or accommodation request work for you and the facility. In other words, what I'm saying is don't make a flat no. Engage in an interactive process. That makes sense? So I'm going to get to your question you asked, I think now. How is it, what is the housing provider able to do to ascertain whether or not a person has a disability? One, you can ask, there are two questions you can ask if a person shows up with a disability, and with a service animal particularly. Are you a person with a disability? And two, is this animal trained to provide you or help you with that disability? If the answer comes back yes, you are better to make the accommodation and give the access. If the answer is no, then you can ask some additional questions. Because you can say, okay, after you ask some additional probing questions, you may be like, okay, you can stay, the animal, you can stay, but you said you haven't identified what the animal does to assist you with your disability, and so the animal may not be covered under Fair Housing Act. You might ask for a pet deposit at that point. A person who is seeking a reasonable accommodation for an emotional support animal may be required to provide documentation from a therapist, a psychologist, a social worker, or a mental health professional. And it has to be a third reliable party. They need to describe in this letter, and we have a lot of debate over notes. The doctor's note need to describe the accommodation, explain the reason or the nexus for the disability and the need of the accommodation. And we get that all of the time. The person with a disability submit a doctor's note for a reasonable accommodation, and the facility don't think the doctor's note go far enough. They will ask for additional documentation, and that's okay as long as it's a legitimate request. But in that documentation, it has to create a nexus for the request. Does that make sense? Okay. The provider must provide a reasonable modification to the facilities, if permissible, if it's affordable, again, to remove any necessary barriers for equal access. See if anything I want to cover here. Again, effective communications with the hard of hearing, those folks who have speech disabilities and others. Say you're a facility that holds church services. You have a community from the deaf, you have someone from the deaf or hard of hearing community. You require the participants to attend religious services. If you have a person from the deaf or hard of hearing community, you need to be able to what? Effectively communicate with that individual. So you probably should have an ASL interpreter there at that event at your expense. Whenever you're making a modification to the property, if you didn't receive federal funding, the person with the disability would have to pay for that a modification. But if you receive federal funding, that modification is done on your dime.
I got a question about that, if I could, real quick.
Yes, absolutely.
So do you know with the deaf and hard of hearing community, if we're providing services and if they ask for an interpreter, do they need to be NIC certified or can they just be locally certified? Do you know?
I don't know that there's a specific certification. Most prefer that you use an ASL, American.
There is. I don't know because my wife's an interpreter. So
yeah, okay. Yeah,
when I worked in child welfare, it was a problem that we ran into. So that's why I wasn't sure if you know. I mean, for child welfare, it's a different system because of obviously dealing with the courts and whatnot. But that's why I didn't know if it was the level of certification we need. Yeah,
ASL is the most acceptable. But if you had, I'm gonna go back to that one thing that we had earlier. That term effective communication, as long as you can effectively communicate with the person, you achieve whatever that request is.
All right, it just makes a difference on the different supports because there's a lot of people who are ASL interpreters, but they're not NIC certified.
Absolutely.
And if we have to have a NIC certified interpreter, it really shrinks the box. So if we can have just an effective interpreter, great.
That's it. Effective communication is what you're shooting for. We talk a little bit about the transgender community, because I want to leave time for questions at the end. The law protects the transgender community from discrimination based on sex. Now, federal statute, Fair Housing Act, actually includes sexual orientation, sexual expression, and gender identity are now covered under the Fair Housing Act. We've always had in our local ordinance here in Chapter 7. A transgender person is someone who presents themselves other than maybe their assigned sex at birth. This aspect can involve their appearance. The behavior is differently than social norms. So treat applicants or residents as the gender they present themselves. This is an issue. Say, for instance, a man is presenting as a woman. Their name that they're being called by is Shirley, and you're asking for an ID requirement, and they show you the ID, and the name on the ID is Jim. And so you say to the person, I will address them by the name that you prefer, Shirley, but for our official documentation reason, I have to use the name on your ID. That makes sense? In an official kind of way. You need to use their official ID name, but you can still address them as the pronouns that they prefer, he, she, or him. And the reason that is because some folks say, listen, your name says Jim on the ID, so I'm going to address you as Jim. You want to avoid that. That makes sense? You want to be careful not to ask somebody if they've had some sexual reassignment surgery. You want to avoid that discussion. You want to avoid if they're on hormones or taking hormonal treatments. You want to avoid that conversation as well. The transgender communities are welcome to bathrooms and showers that correspond, watch this, with their self-identity, how they identify themselves. The biggest problem is making sure that everyone in the facility feels safe. It's a recommendation, and it's really swept across the country a few years ago when these topics came up, particularly about gender-neutral restrooms. It's good to have a gender-neutral restroom in the facility if you can, but a lot of folks have just removed, the his and hers, his restroom, her restroom, and now they're putting his, her, / on the same restroom. So if a restroom facility is available, anybody can go in and use it at that time. This is the equal access rule. HUD requires housing programs to be made available to individuals and families without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. And all of these are federal rules that apply to that section. This is just a continuation of the rule for the disabled community. And you can see all of the recipients, the ESC grants, the COC grants, and the HOPA grants. They're all covered under the Fair Housing Act, the Disability Act, and Title II. For instance, if the potential client requests to be placed based on his or her sex assignment at birth, HUD assumes that the provider will place the individual in accordance to which they could request. Privacy issues often play out in these kinds of situations. If the client or folks who are staying in the facility express safety and privacy concerns, look and explore on how you can address those concerns. They must take reasonable steps to address their concerns. They may include, for example, responding to the request and client expressing concern through additional private petitions and curtains. You can't segregate a community away from a general population, but if somebody makes a request or you have the ability to do it, and they ask for a privacy curtain or some other kind of petition for privacy reasons, and you can accommodate that, please try to do so. There may be a situation where they may request private shower situations. Again, if at all possible, there's another place in the facility where we can accommodate that. Let's try to make that happen. Religious exemption. If a shelter is on and operated other than a commercial purpose by a religious organization, they are exempt from discrimination laws. Watch this. As long as you're not eliminating people based on their race, their color, and so forth and so on, and gender, but you are exempt from the Fair Housing Act. That's just a statute that adds further clarification. All right, I want to leave enough time for questions and answers, and so we got about 10 minutes here. So I want to leave some time for questions. So if you have a question, just really unmute yourself, and I'll take your question.
There are currently no questions in chat, Jeffrey.
All right, they can unmute if they like, if you have a question. I know I didn't do that great a job, so let me review for you. I know I'm awesome, but I know I didn't do that good a job. So I want to be sure that we be careful of not to discriminate where in our intake process. Well, first come into our facilities is where we most run into issues of discrimination. People think the rules are being applied differently to other folks. You want to make sure that your procedures and standards are consistent to apply in every situation to every person who comes in the door appropriately. be mindful if you get a regional accommodations request for a qualified person with a disability, whether the disability is readily available, you know right away. You have a gentleman come in, he's got dark glasses on, he has a red tip cane and a dog in a harness. Do we need to ask that individual if they have a disability? No. If a person with a disability come in and say, I'm making an accommodation request, I have low vision and blind, so I'm asking that you provide me a documentation in a larger print. Is that a reasonable accommodation request? Give me a nod, yes. Right? Is that a reasonable accommodation request? I'm low vision, you're asking me to fill out an application, and I ask for it in a larger print. What do you have an obligation to do? Give them the large print.
Getting a larger
right?
print.
Exactly, because you can violate fair housing law. Somebody says, I have a learning disability. And yes, I know there's a line of people waiting out here to be served, but I need a little bit more time to fill out this application. What should you do? Give them that time. Give them a pen, give them a place, and allow them to fill out that application. And when they're done, they can come back, right, and say, I've completed it, right? Those are all of the little ways that discrimination can show up.
If I can ask a question, just to clarify that one right
Absolutely.
there. I do think it's important because there's a difference between giving a little bit more time in the moment and giving more time like extra days or weeks, because there are some things that are time sensitive.
Absolutely.
So I agree with you 100%, on the, if they came to you and if you're like, hey, I need this in 5 minutes, and they're like, hey, no, I need like another like 20 minutes because this is my issue. But if they're like, hey, I need another 5 days, but the window is an only 10-day period, wouldn't it be more appropriate to say, well, how about I sit and help you, or we work on this together? Because there are sometimes, and I'm just being realistic, we do have clients in the housing aspect that they're just constantly missing the deadlines, like hard day deadlines.
Yes.
And so I know I encourage my staff as a supervisors that rather than having them miss those deadlines, sit down with them in a system if need be. But I think we need to make that distinction, because I don't think we could have, again, having clients giving them additional days, so to speak, if we don't have that time.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate?
Yeah, remember I said the word here, the opposite word here is reasonable.
Reasonable. Right. I just want to make sure, but I want to make sure that we clarify that, because I think that there was a little bit of a gray line there. So
exactly. And you were talking about adding maybe a staff person to a system. Sometimes you don't have the staff person available. And if that's the case, hey, you need more time, I'm going to have you come back at an appointed time where we would have some staff persons to sit down and go through the application process with you, as long as you're not just turning them away. The other thing about a person with a disability, say they have they show up with another relative. You're talking to the person with a disability, you're having a difficult time communicating with them. Here's what you can't do. You can't say, can this person take care of this for you? You can't do that. Now, you can ask the person with a disability, the person with a disability can say to you, I want them to speak for me. That's acceptable. That makes sense? Okay.
Mr. Jeffrey, I had one
Yes.
question.
Absolutely.
In reference to teenagers able to watch minor children, can you remind us of the age, the minimum age?
Well, there isn't necessarily a minimum age. They can be 18 to 16, at what we might consider a responsible age to be able to watch children. You don't want to have a 10-year-old and maybe a 6-year-old, watching each other. You just want, again, what's that word? Reasonable. There's a reasonable expectation of our organization that your minor children be supervised. Not necessarily supervised by a parent or an adult, but they must be supervised. And great question, thank you.
So there's no clear-cut age?
No, there's no
What you're
clear-cut age, no cutoff
Okay.
age.
So it's contingent on the child's level of maturity?
Yes.
as
Okay.
I say, from a child welfare standpoint, which I know a lot of us came from, that's exactly what it is. I mean, There's some 10-year-olds that are mature enough to take care of their sibling for a certain amount of time. There's some 16-year-olds that are not. So it really does matter from a child welfare standpoint. It was always, what is their ability to protect and self-protect?
It is individual. It's an individual assessment of each situation. Any other questions?
Jeffrey, in the chat, we're being asked if we can get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation.
Absolutely, we'll make it available. And I thought it was also being recorded. I thought I heard a recording that is being recorded as well.
We are absolutely being recorded, and this will be posted to the HLA's website.
But we will make the PowerPoint available, absolutely.
So Jeffrey, you could send that to me, and then I will forward it on to participants. So
Absolutely.
again, please make sure that you enter your name and organization into the chat so that I have a record of who all has attended.
And Avery, if you can make sure I get a copy of that too for my own records. Also, let me throw this out here, Avery. If you get a copy of the names of the individuals who attended this training, I can give them a certificate that they completed their housing training as well.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Absolutely. Any more questions? Any more questions? Be mindful of the work that you do, and you all know this already is very, very important. I know, like
Are you going up there?
I serve on the diversity and inclusion committee for the COC. I know the populations that you deal with can be difficult. I know there are multiple challenges to working with certain communities and populations. But what the work you do is so important. We want to make sure that we provide equal access and treatment to all people who come through our threshold. And what I often say when I address communities such as yours, we know that we have frequent flyers. We know that we have people who show up over and over again and don't seem to advance through the process. And what I often say is you never know if this is the day that's going to start their journey in the right direction. So if you're mindful of that. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Jeffrey.
Yes, ma'am.
So if we do come across where we're seeing that an organization or housing or shelter is discriminating or not following the Title Disabilities Act, how do we, or who do we report that to? Do we go through our chain of command and it goes up? Up to you.
Yeah, well, you can certainly talk to the folk in your facility, because I'm sure they don't want a fair housing investigation to try to get them done. But and that's actually a great question too, because if you're witnessing acts of discrimination, you have an obligation to report it. You don't have to be the victim of the discrimination, but if you see it happening, you have an obligation to report it. We do public accommodation investigations. We do Title III investigations of violations of the Civil Rights Act. We also do fair housing investigations through our office. So if anyone is being discriminated against, that is my information on the screen now. I got to take Paul's email off of there. That is my direct line. You can certainly reach out to me.
Can't we also report them to the DBPR?
Absolutely. There's a whole lot. Yeah, there's a whole lot of places you can report them, but we're one available as well. All right, Avery and everyone, thank you for your time.
One last, I'm
Yes.
sorry.
No problem. I'm here. I'm here for you.
I'm sorry. I am a bugaboo.
No, I'm here for you.
We have come across, as far as when we get to the whole Fair Housing Act, there's been quite a few apartment complexes where they will say that they take a voucher, but then they're asking outside of the realm of what they should be asking for. for that particular client. Or they say they do, and then once we get in there, then they get the client there, then they snatch it away from them, be it because of the way they look or whatever the case may be. Of course, you can't pinpoint that, but who can we report that to? Like, that's happening more times than not.
It is, and again, it's us. And we've had situations where folks have negotiated with the landlord on the rental price, have purchased furniture to go into the apartment, and they show up with the client, and then all of a sudden, the person says no. If you believe it's based on one of those protected categories we talked about, race, gender, national origin, and you believe that's the reason, HUD also has testing facilities. So if you can report it to HUD and say you want a test done at that facility, then that same landlord or whoever that property owner is, and they can go in and do a test. And you send somebody in basically with the same income requirements, the same voucher requirement, just maybe of a different race, different gender, and you test that situation to see if it's truly a discriminatory practice. And so, yes, you can report that. We don't do testing in our own office, but we can arrange from one of our colleagues to do some testing who do that kind of thing. There are testing programs around the country. And thank you for that, again, a great question.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for your attendance this morning. And yes, if you put your name and organization into the chat, you will be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint. Please give me a few days to get that done. And I'll send it all out to supervisors along with a list of who attended so that you'll get a copy. Please note that we are recording, and the recording will be placed onto the HLA, the Homeless Leadership Alliance website. Additionally, for more information on reporting violations, you can reach the HLA's website for the coordinated entries, policies, and procedures. And they do have details within those policies and procedures on how to make reports. Are there any further questions? Jeffrey, I want to thank you so much on behalf of the Continuum of Care and the Homeless Leadership Alliance. Thank you for being a wonderful partner within the Continuum of Care. I'm going to leave this open for a few more moments so that you can ensure that you've got your sign-in information in the chat. And thank you, everybody, and have a happy Thursday.